it's such an honor to be here with my mentors. When I think about, I met Dr. Watson in 1985, and I think Marilyn, I even met you before that when I was in Canada. This goes back to when I was a master's student and just learning about what the essence of nursing is, and it's about our knowledge and nursing theory. And there was a lot of excitement in Toronto at that time because they were talking about the standards of care being grounded in nursing science and nursing theory. So a lot of the hospitals at that time were beginning to implement theories in the hospital. And so there's a lot of excitement, and a lot of theorists and theorist conferences were going on, and Discovery National. Oh, well, I'm so glad, Marlene, you're able to come back, because I just love your work and it's so inspirational. And I'm now at FAU very much because of Marlene recruiting me there. And now I'm working with these doctoral students that are using your theory. And that's why I developed that methodology, so that they can continue to build your science. And thanks for mentioning that. That's great. But yeah, your work is just amazing. I feel that what I'm going to be talking about is like the canvas that we're sort of like painting on, and that's Rogerian science, and that worldview, that new paradigm, the unitary transformative paradigm that your work is grounded in, and now also Dr. Watson's work is linked in. So it's that canvas that sort of like we're painting on, and I want to try to bring some clarity to understanding those concepts and principles that are in Rogerian science. But I feel that a lot of what Dr. Watson and Dr. Smith have said is, your words have been adding clarity all along to what unitary science is. And so your views and everything are totally consistent with, of course, what Martha was talking about. And it's just an honor to be in your presence. You've been mentors to me throughout my career, starting in the mid-'80s. So it's been, this is just a great panel. And for all of those of you who are out there, I actually have spent, my wife is from Brazil, and so I've spent a lot of time in South America and in Brazil, and also in Colombia as well, where there's a lot of Watson work that's going on in Colombia. I was working with a university in Bogota, Juan Corpus University, and they're using your theory in the curriculum, Dr. Watson. So that's really quite exciting. I know that in my introduction, I'm also known for my work with Nick, but I don't see any of that as separate. My whole career has been around our unique body of knowledge, whether it be our conceptual systems, our philosophy, but also our nursing languages that actually give a language to what we do, and how do we evaluate what we do. And that's the work that I do with classification with Nick and Nock. Now that work from my perspective is theoretical. So, it's how you conceptualize what Nick interventions are and how you conceptualize what Nock interventions are. We still need words and languages and names for things that we do and what we are looking for in terms of change processes in patients. So from my perspective, from a unitary perspective, Nick really are mutual patterning strategies. They're energetic, and they aren't interventions, they are mutual patterning strategies. So it's how you conceptualize them, but they're just names for what we do. And outcomes, the Nock outcomes within a unitary perspective would be conceptualized as potentials or possibilities to change, because it's not predictable or causal. It's just possibilities. So it's how you conceptualize. I mean, you can conceptualize the classification languages from Orem or Roy's perspective. So depending on what lens you're looking through, they take on new meaning. And that's actually what theory does, right? Theory is what gives meaning to concepts. And so, Marlene, you mentioned Polly's work about how, that's the theoretical linkage that goes with looking at concepts. Concepts take on different meaning depending on what conceptual lens that you're looking through them with. So I'm going to be talking about Rogerian science. I'm going to share my screen and tell a little bit of the story. of how I got to this point. So I hope that you can see the slides, right? You see the first slide?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So there's a portrait of Martha that hangs at NYU, where she was a dean for 25 years. And her work, I think, has been so foundational to the discipline. And she created one of probably the first doctoral program in nursing science, and the whole program at NYU is grounded in a unitary science perspective. And Marlene is the current president of the Society of Rogerian Scholars. It's been around since 1988, and I was a member of that from the very beginning. So why are we talking about Rogerian science in this conference that really is focusing on unitary caring science? And it really goes back to the statement that Jean wrote in 2020. I know that her thinking goes back much earlier than that, even back to that 1999 article that Marlene and Dr. Watson wrote together, where it was really that's where the zipper took place, that brought in the unitary perspective with caring, and a unitary caring science evolved out of that. I think evolved out of that 1999 article.
Excuse me, Dr. Butcher, if you could speak just a little bit more slowly, please.
Yeah, I'm going pretty fast.
Gracias.
Yeah. So it was in that 1999 article that where I think that there was the movement of bringing the unitary perspective and meshing it with Rogers and caring science coming together, and the work of reconceptualizing caring within a unitary perspective. And so I think that to really understand the work that Marlene is talking about, and the work that Dr. Watson is talking about, is having a foundational understanding of what Martha was talking about in terms of unitary science. So this is kind of like the big picture then of what unitary science is, and it informs unitary caring science. I was thinking about how that, I read a book by David Pink, and he talks about how we're moving from, if you look at evolutionary, we move from the agricultural age to the industrial age. And now a lot of people think that we're in the information age, right? Everything is about information system and information processing. But I think we have moved out of the information age, and we are now in what he calls the conceptual age, because information is meaningless without some sort of conceptual framing of what the information means. And so these theories and theoretical work that's going on in nursing is representative of the conceptual age that we're in. And I see that coming back into nursing. I think we lost it a little bit through the 90s and the early 2000s, but now with the statement from the ANA about the new definition of nursing and the integration of caring and caring science and nursing theory back into nursing, I think that that's representative of this idea of we're moving into what he calls the conceptual age. And so understanding these frameworks is very important then to understanding our practice and what we do. So this was the book that really kind of, this title, when I saw this, Dr. Watson, to see unitary up there, unitary caring science, of course, it brought, Rogers right to the forefront for me when I saw that title. So in my trajectory, this is where it sort of all started. I'm standing there next to Martha Rogers, and this was at a theory conference when I was a master's student. And I sat next to Martha during lunch, and she turned to me and asked, what was I doing in my master's thesis? And I hadn't really understood her unitary perspective yet, but I was trying to use her theory, but I was also trying to use other theories that were incompatible with her view, because I didn't understand what a paradigm was. And I didn't understand that there's, you can't mix ideas that are really not compatible with one another. So when I left that lunch, and I got the distinct idea that I was trying to mix two things together. I was mixing a stress and coping model with unitary-caring science together into one conceptual framework that she said that I needed to get off the fence because I had my foot into two different worldviews. One, an old worldview, which is based on stress, coping, and adaptation, versus a unitary perspective, which those concepts really don't have meaning within a unitary perspective. And so I spent that whole summer after this conference really learning and studying Rogerian science by reading her works and reading the works that she cited in her 1970 book, and also reading a lot of dissertations that were coming out of NYU that were applying her theory and explaining it in dissertation and research work. And I ended up modeling my conceptual framework after those works that were being done at NYU. And then that's me giving her a copy of my master's thesis when it was done. And then a year later or so, we were on a panel together at a theory conference where Martha interviewed or demonstrated her theory and practice with a simulated patient, which is that lady in the white coat there. And the way that Martha modeled her framework was just a work of art. It was just so beautiful. But it was just a great privilege to be able to have those kinds of connections to her. And really, I think that she changed, she did change my life completely. And then I took a course with her when I was a PhD student, and again, was using her conceptual framework in my dissertation work. And this was at Nag's Head, where the Wright brothers flew the first plane, and we all walked up to the monument up there, and I snapped this picture of her standing underneath the statue because for me, she really was a genius. So just so that you know that I've pretty much immersed in my career in Rogerian science. So my thesis and my dissertation published about 22 journal articles, book chapters, and a lot of conference presentations. And I have this wiki site that anybody can access that is a work that is, taking a long time to do, but there's a lot of content up there where there's a sort of like a lot of information about it. It's designed like a textbook where you can learn more about Rogerian science. And that's what that cover of that book looks like. So I did this slide, I added the last minute because I was working on another presentation for the Rogerian conference. And I decided that maybe I should share this in this presentation as well. I'm kind of glad I did because both Dr. Watson and Dr. Smith talked about the three major paradigms that comes out of the work of Newman, Corcoran, Perry, and Syme, and of the particular deterministic, interactive, integrative, and unitary transformer as the three major paradigms. Dr. Watson talks about this as era 1, 2, and 3, in that we are sort of like moving from this progression from the particular deterministic to the interactive integrative to the unitary transformative. And then when you look at Marlene's diagram, she showed how conceptual frameworks flow from each of these different paradigms, mid-range theories flow from those conceptual frameworks, and then practice and research methodologies flow from them. For me, the particularly deterministic is more or less the medical model sort of thing. I don't believe there's really any nursing theories that are grounded in purely a particularly deterministic perspective. Most of the frameworks, I think of, Roy, Orm, Leidinger, those frameworks are really interactive, integrative paradigms. And it's the view that I think most of us are most familiar with. And then it's really Martha Rogers that formulated and founded the unitary transformative paradigm. But I've come to think that caring, Marlene talked about how caring has not been included with Watson's perspective, within Fawcett's perspective of the meta paradigm. And I think it should be, and I've written as far back as 2004, that caring is a meta paradigm concept. But I'm going to take that a little further and say that I think that we have a caring paradigm, and that all the caring theories are grounded within the caring paradigm. But it really isn't, there's like two schools of thought within this caring paradigm. Some of those caring theories are informed by an interactive, integrative perspective. That's why I have an arrow going down to that. And then some of the caring theories, the school of thought is really informed by a unitary transformative perspective. And I would put Dr. Watson and Marlene Smith's work as a school of thought within this paradigm of caring. And Parsi now is talking about her work as a separate paradigm, but it's informed also from a unitary transformative perspective. So I'm calling this sort of like a constellation of paradigms. I'm saying that there's really 5 paradigms in nursing by adding Parsi's human becoming and a caring paradigm that includes 2 schools of thought, and calling that a constellation. So what I'm going to be talking about then is really what is that unitary transformative paradigm that's grounded in a unitary perspective that really is the work of Rogerian science and Martha's work. And this is a slide that is based on a table that Martha had in some of her early work, where this is what she was talking about when she was saying that, Howard, you have your foot in 2 different perspectives. You know, I was talking about a stress and coping model, which is the old view. And these are sort of like the concepts and ideas that are within the old view. And her work, she said, is grounded in a new paradigm, a new view, and they're really not compatible with one another. And so I needed to make a decision about, where is my work going to be situated? Is it within a unitary perspective, which is the new view, or an outdated, what she would say was an outdated view based on Cartesian physics, which is a cause and effect reductionistic view of the universe. And so each of these words is kind of like the transition from the old to the new, going from looking at parts and pieces like cells to thinking about energy fields that are not reducible to particulates, or thinking of a universe that's always declining to one that's growing more and more complex and ever expanding. Thinking about the universe and the world as being 3-dimensional to being infinite and pan-dimensional. Thinking about, rather than homeostasis, where everything is about adaptation and equilibrium, to moving to the idea that everything is always dynamic and changing, which is homeodynamics. Stop, thinking about moving away from the world as separate, where person and environment are dichotomous and not really connected to one another, to where they are integral. So you can look at each one of those, and her unitary perspective is grounded in this new view. And it took me a while to grasp this, and I had to read a lot of work in order to understand what is this new paradigm and this new view of science that she was talking about. And this idea of going from being to becoming is part of it, because it's always, one is static and one is like continuously changing. Well, I don't know why it's making that noise. I shouldn't. Sorry about that. So these are some of the works that she cited in her 1970 book. She talks about, she read these works. She grabbed ideas from these works, but then she synthesized them into something that was entirely new. So it's important to understand that her work just didn't come out of a vacuum. That there is a body of knowledge that her work, unitary science, is grounded upon. And going back and looking at some of this work would help also understand what she's talking about and where those ideas came from. These are books that are still accessible out there, and I think that are valuable for anybody to try to read. So her idea of pan-dimensionality, evolved out of Einstein's idea of relativity. Her idea of openness comes from Bertalanffy's idea of open systems. Her idea of evolutionary change and how the universe is evolving comes out of Desjardins' work of the phenomenon of man, and the importance of personal knowledge. Subjectivity, it's just not about objectivity, comes out of the work by Polanyi. So her ideas of science and what's science, and she was very rigorous as a scientist. Bertrand Russell questioned causality, and Popper talked about how science is built and how science is discovered. And I believe that Dr. Watson even mentioned Whitehead's work, and his ideas about what science is are all foundational to this emerging unitary view. And of course, Nightingale's notes on work on nursing. And then there's these other theories that these are works that Martha, over her writings, would she would include references to these works. They're not exactly consistent with her conceptual framework, but these are other scientific systems and theories that resonate, that inform, that help understand her conceptual system. So you know that her unitary science is not something that is an isolation of other scientific perspectives. There's a lot of consistencies with her work with systems theory and relativity theory and quantum theory, which is the idea of that everything is energy, and unpredictability of helicity coming out of chaos theories, and energy fields that inform development. Sheldrake talks about morphogenic fields. Prigogine has this theory of how change occurs unpredictably, and it's called the theory of dissipative structures. Probably one of the best books I ever read was Capra's, not the book, The Web of Life, which is a great book too, but The Turning Point was a really great book to understand of how we're shifting from an old view to a new view. And Marlene talked about the implicate and explicate order that Bohm talks about, and Margaret Newman also based her work on. So here are some assumptions and some ideas that come out of this new worldview, that it's about, Martha, understanding what the word unitary means is that that people in the universe are irreducible wholes. And so the idea of parts and wholes actually become reversed. It's that the whole is in the part. And I'm writing another article that's looking at metaphors and how metaphors can inform Rogerian science. And, there's a phrase that comes out of Blakesworth of seeing a universe in a grain of sand. And we're not saying that from a unitary perspective, the grains of sand don't exist, but you can see the whole in the part, much like a hologram, like Gene Watson was talking about. But it's not the part that we look at from a unitary perspective. What we're looking at is the sand dune or the beach or the sand castle as a whole, and not looking at the grains of sand. Other people and other disciplines can look at the grains of sand, and that's the basis of their science and their discipline, like medicine, that likes to look at the genes and the cells. But from a unitary perspective, we're not looking at the grains of sand as much as we're looking at the beach and the manifestation of what sand, creates as a whole, like the sand dunes and that are constantly changing, and the beaches that are constantly changing. So there ultimately are no parts then, there's only a unitary whole. And that everything that we see is really a manifestation of this process, this integral process between the human and the universe field that's integral and simultaneous, and creation comes out of that. So all the patterning that we see around us is manifest through this underlying process of the entire web of connectedness. And we know that there's a scientific paradigm that's kind of more consistent with the Rogerian perspective. And if you want to learn and read more about constructivism, that would be an idealism, or philosophies of science that are more consistent with the Rogerian perspective than let's say positivism would be. The new paradigm, I think that we need to move away from looking at parts to thinking about networks and looking at manifestations of wholes, and realizing that reality is really all a connection of networks, and that the unitary paradigm, that there isn't just one truth, there's multiple truths, there's multiple realities. And so that's what that idea of pandimensionality gets to, is that there's multiple universes. So appreciating and understanding that. This diagram was influenced by a diagram that I saw that John Phillips published in a book chapter. I just kind of expanded it, where he talked about that what we know guides what we do, and that there's a connection between this unitary cosmology, which is the most abstract, to a philosophy that evolves out of cosmologies, to ontologies, epistemologies, and ethics, systems of ethics that evolve out of our philosophy. And all this is being informed by this unitary perspective. And then it informs the creation of the unitary transformative paradigm. And caring science is informed by that. And transpersonal, it's all one whole, all connected. And that's another picture of Martha. That's a stained glass window that was created. Then there was a banner that was made from that. So I'm going to now talk about and try to explain what Rogerian science is from, I probably won't be able to get through all this, but my goal is for at least get through the major concepts and principles, and I'm going to try to explain them in a way that brings the abstract more to maybe somewhat concrete. So Martha talks about unitary human beings that are irreducible wholes. And when we talk about an irreducible whole, it means it can't be broken down into parts, and that parts have really have no meaning outside the context of the whole. So that's what her statement means when she talks about a person as being more than and different from the sum of parts. So a part tells you nothing about a whole. So we don't talk about in the unitary perspective of mind, body, and spirit. We don't talk about biopsychosocial, spiritual, cultural, because those are really all parts, and a person is more than and different from the sum of those parts. The person, the unitary human being, is not only an irreducible whole, but the environment is an irreducible whole, and they're in mutual process with one another. So in a sense, then the human being and as an energy field and the environment as an energy field are open to each other in mutual process and co-evolve together in a dynamic, continuous way and in an acausal, nonlinear way. So the life process is always constantly changing. It's creative because always new things are evolving out of this process. And uncertainty and innovation and growing diversities are features and characteristics of this change process. Martha talks about patterns and everything, not everybody, most people I don't think can actually see an energy field. Some people do see it, but most people don't have the capacity to see the energy field. But what we do see through our senses are manifestations of the energy field. And that is everything that you see around us, everything you hear, perceive, taste, all through your senses. And we're limited because as human beings, we don't see the entire light spectrum. We see only part. So the reality that we see really isn't what reality is, right? It's only what our senses allow us to see. But we do see manifestations of pattern, and that becomes the focus, and the operational concept in Rogerian science is pattern, because that is what we see. So a person that's presenting to us with, for care, it's what we're really appreciating and seeing are their patterns, that everything, what they say, what they experience, their lab values, you're taking blood pressures, those are all patterns that are manifesting out of their environmental mutual field process. And you're seeing it as a whole, as a reflection of the whole, and not just a physiological indicator. So everything is, all information is relevant, but it's interpreted within this unitary perspective as a manifestation of the whole. And then Martha talks about how a person is characterized by the ability to have thought, abstraction, imagery, language, thought, sensation, and all that, and that we participate in this change process knowingly. And I think the work by Elizabeth Barrett is so critical, because it's a great way of operationalizing unitary science and thinking about, well, how can we facilitate persons to participate more knowingly in their own change process to help them move in the direction that they want to go into in terms of their human becoming and their human betterment and well-being. So these are Martha's theory is both simple and complex at the same time. It's really understanding these four concepts, which she called postulates. They're postulates because she's postulating that this is what the reality is, and nursing, she says, needs to be based on the most contemporary scientific knowledge. So all of these postulates are grounded in a scientific perspective. And that groundwork was laid in her 1970 book. And so she references the scientific bases for each of these concepts, and then they're synthesized together as these three principles that really are describing the nature what she says are describing the nature of change. So there's sometimes a misunderstanding about what energy field means. And it's really important to grasp that within a Rogers perspective, within a unitary perspective, she is not talking about electrodynamic field. That's a physical field. She's not talking about energy in the way that physicists talk about an energy field, not even the way that quantum physicists talk about energy field. She's talking about that everything is energy, even thought is energy, right? And so it really becomes more of a metaphor of the dynamic nature of the field. Because if you want to reduce a field to a psychological field or a social field or a physical field, that's a reductionistic view that's not consistent with what she's talking about when she's talking about energy. It's true that in her early work, when she was referencing Burr and Northrop, they were measuring energy potentials around trees. And so they were measuring with a voltmeter, and it was evidence that there is an energy field out there. And you can measure this energy field if you have instruments that are sensitive enough. But that's not what she is really talking about when we think about the contemporary understanding of what an energy field is with a unitary perspective. It's not electrodynamic, it's energy in the abstract sense. So everything is energy. And we know that it is grounded in physics. It is grounded in the idea of Einstein's and quantum theory perspective that shows that everything really is an energy. But the important thing about grasping the idea of energy is that it is the fundamental unit of all things, living and non-living. So everything is energy. It's how that energy is organized that makes it different. So my energy field is organized differently. That's why I look different from someone else. And this table that I'm sitting at, this made out of the same fundamental, it's energy, but the way that energy field is organized it takes on a different characteristic of pattern. So the importance of energy and looking at energy field is that idea field it's a unifying concept, and so you can't reduce the field to, you can't, where does it begin and where does it end? It's infinite. There is no beginning and end to a field. And if you want to use as an example a magnetic field or electric field, it's the same sort of idea. You can't divide a energy field that's a magnetic field into a part. It's infinite. It changes in strength and density as you move away from its source and its center. But it's a unifying concept. You can't divide a field up. And also, energy is dynamic, so it signifies the constant change. And a field is in continuous motion, and that's that dynamic nature. So those are the ideas that you want to get out of the idea of thinking about energy, and the word unitary, because energy field cannot be reduced to a part. By definition, understanding the concept of openness from a unitary perspective flows from understanding what she's talking about in terms of the energy field, because by definition and by actuality, an energy field doesn't have any boundary. They are open and they're infinite, and they expand, forever. And so she's talking about an energy field being open that's not a little bit open, but it's open continuously and it's open consistently. And that's why when we talk about the human environmental field, that everything then is connected to everything else. And when everything is open and connected to everything else, because everything is energy and it's only differentiated by its pattern and how the energy is organized, then you really can't talk about causality, because what is making something happen if everything is connected to everything else? So causality fades into the background and becomes not really relevant within this system. It's not searching for causes of why things happen, but I think really from a unitary perspective, what's important is knowing what is the pattern and where do people want to go? What is the change that they want to create? Other disciplines can look at what the causes, and if that's what they want to focus on. But nursing doesn't need to understand the causes, just understand that it's a dynamic process and let's talk about what change and how can we pattern the human field and the environmental field in the direction that really contributes to human betterment and well-becoming. And so the universe then is sort of this open idea that questions then the existence of causality. Bertrand Russell would talk about how causality is really a human construct, that we just invented this idea that we have to find cause and effects just to kind of simplify our world, so that we can understand things, but it doesn't make it that that's the way the world really is. Same thing with time. We have clocks and we measure time with calendars, and there's different kinds of systems to measure time, but time is a human construct. When you look and you understand quantum cosmology, time doesn't really exist in the quantum realm and in the universe. We invented time, and we invented time to make things more simple so that everything doesn't appear that it happens all at once. So this idea of, there not really being any time and not really being any cause and effect really are based on contemporary ideas that are grounded in quantum cosmology, and Rogers' work is more consistent with that. So that's why we talk about the human environmental field, because they're both energy fields, open and integral to one another. So there's no cause and effect of one causing the other.
Howard, I'm sorry, we're going to give you a 10 more minute, if that's all right. Thank you.
I think we'll see how, let's just keep on going.
Yes, I know that you started late, so just, we're flexible on that, of course.
Okay.
Thank you.
So her third concept is the concept of pattern, which I described earlier as the operational concept or postulate within her system, because it's what we can see and it's what we really focus on as nurses. And she just describes pattern as the distinguishing characteristic of an energy field, because it's what emerges out of that human environment field mutual process. And since you can't reduce it down into a part, it's perceived as a single wave, not as a part of a wave. It's a reflection of the whole. But everything then is pattern. And so like in the Rogerian practice methodology, what you're really perceiving and appreciating is the person's pattern, which is a manifestation of their energy field in mutual process with their environmental field. And all information is coming at you as the single wave, but you're interpreting it from a unitary perspective. And I thought that Dr. Smith did a really nice job in explaining the idea of pan-dimensionality in relationship to her theory. I think sometimes this might be the most difficult concept to kind of sort of grasp. Her definition has never changed. She has changed the word from multidimensionality. Before that, it was four-dimensionality, and then she changed it to pan-dimensionality. But the definition has never changed throughout the evolution, and it simply describes the universe and everything as a non-linear domain without spatial or temporal attributes. And that's the idea that the energy field exists and everything is energy in a domain that is non-linear, meaning that it's not cause and effect and is beyond space and time. And that goes, we're kind of like stuck in this three-dimensional world, but we see that there's evidence of realities and events that can't be explained simply within our three-dimensional perspective. And so there's lots of great ways of understanding and reading about pan-dimensionality. I think the books, Flatland and Sphereland are books that were written that show, what is it like if you were all living in Flatland and a three-dimensional object. So if it was just 2 dimensions and a three-dimensional object comes into our world, what would that look like? And in Sphereland, what would a 4-dimensional object look like that appeared into our 3-dimensional world? Reading books like that sort of like help understand what this concept is. But also, I think there's lots of evidence out there when we think about, Martha would talk about events that can't be explained within our 3-dimensional worldview. We label those as paranormal events, clairvoyance, it's knowing that something's going to happen before it happens. So there's evidence. There's a lot of stuff out there that shows that's quackery, but there's institutes that have done research on paranormal events that show that it's real. Okay, so reading some of that work can help understand its relevance to understanding human experience, because patients, and I've been with patients that have experienced, and many of you I know been with patients that have experienced things that you really can't be described. And this concept is a way of giving some sort of theoretical basis and understanding for events that are difficult to understand within our limited perspective. Then she synthesized these concepts, postulates into these three principles, the principle of residency, and they all describe the nature of change, this continuous change in everything, because energy is dynamic. It has a wave frequency and a wave frequency pattern. And this is a change from lower to higher wave frequency patterns that we were always evolving in changing in this direction. I think that John Phillips talks about how it's really going back and forth, that it's not just a linear progression from higher to lower, but it's a movement of going back and forth between lower and higher frequency. But you can see, we have expressions in everyday life that talk about how, we're on different wavelengths as a way of expressing how we're not really synchronous and understanding one another. So being in tune with someone, is this idea of, are we on the same, frequency pattern? And really our lives, right, are there's all kinds of rhythms in our lives. And you can see patterns of change throughout the universe, and throughout the, we live on circadian rhythms that are going on. There's constantly sound, light, everything really is a frequency pattern, and it's those patterns that we perceive. And Healy describes this idea that this change process is always unpredictable, it's innovative, it's going towards creative, the more increasing diversity of patterns. And then integrality is really this idea of how the human environmental field are in this mutual process and co-evolving together. So she sort of laid out this system, and she then described the human and environmental fields, and this is like a synthesis of all of the postulates and principles together. And you can see that there's really the human field and the environmental field almost the same definition, but the idea is that they're integral to one another. And so we can focus on the human field, but knowing that the human field is always in mutual process with the environmental field. And that's one way of visualizing it, that there's no boundary between the person's environment and who they are as a person. The energy field are integral with one another. There's some new concepts that are evolving as the science builds. Martha laid out that system. She developed 3 theories that she put out there, and I'll show what those are if we get to it. But the idea of unitariology is a term that John Phillips coined, is the study of unitary science. So my giving this presentation and you studying unitary science is really the science of unitariology. The idea of pandimensionalis, where we talk about homo sapiens, but if we look at the person as an energy field that has infinite dimensions, then the idea that we really are moving towards, and we are homo pandimensionalis and well-becoming. Marlene talked about, John introduced that idea that well-being is sort of static, and if we think about everything as being in process, then the better way of expressing that changing process of change would be well-becoming, since becoming is not static. I like the term energy spirit. I think that I know that Jean talks and uses the term spirit. I've mentioned to her that I think that if you really, to be consistent with the unitary perspective, thinking about spirit as energy, because Martha would say that spirit is like a part, right? But if you reconceptualize spirit within an energetic perspective, then that would be more consistent with a unitary perspective. So I like this combining of the 2 words, energy and spirit, that John did in that 2015 article. And then Elizabeth's work of power as knowing participation and change is something that really would be foundational and good to read about. So this is idea, I think, like understanding, Jean uses the word unitary, and we're all using this word unitary, and it's situated, the work of unitary caring science is in this unitary perspective. So it's just understanding that unitary is meaning not that a person doesn't have any parts, and you wouldn't reduce the person to parts in a unitary human being. Parts tell you nothing about a whole. And unitary means that it's inclusive with the environment. And unitary thinking performs a new way of actually interpreting and thinking about the world in front of you. This is another way of depicting the relationship between cosmology, philosophy, the science of unitary human beings, and you got the postulates, the principles, manifestations, and theories that all flow from that. That's what work is from John. And then, from this unitary perspective, there's a unitary cosmology, a unitary ontology, a unitary epistemology, ethics, and aesthetics. I think everybody's going to have a copy of these slides then, right? Because I won't be able to go over them, but if people have a copy of the slides, they can read about what each of these are. What is the universe from a unitary perspective? So looking at interpreting the universe from a unitary perspective is this idea that there's, that the universe is indivisible and is made of energy, and that there's not just one universe, there's multiple universes. The universe is pan-dimensionality, and the universe is constantly rhythmically changing, and it's unpredictable, always moving to greater diversity and creativity.
5 minutes, please, Dr. Butcher. Thank you.
Okay. So the unitary cosmology is the idea. This is the field, the unitary field that Jean is talking about. When you would try to understand and visualize what that is, it's the fundamental unity of everything. You can't reduce anything to its part, and it's pan-dimensional. The unitary ontology is looking at what is reality? What does reality look like? And it really goes back to her definitions and her postulates. That the person and the human being is and the environment is irreducible. It's identified by pattern. That's the way of thinking about the ontology, that it's made of, everything is energy. Energy is dynamic and constant motion. Change is continuous. It's always unpredictable. It's creative. It evolves. Human beings and the environments are constantly in this process of unfolding potentials. And appearances are patterns. So everything that we see is a pattern that emerges out of this field. It emerges acausally. It comes out rhythmically, and it's unpredictable. So human beings in our environment are then pan-dimensional, meaning that they're non-linear, non-temporal, non-spatial, and it really describes the relative nature of change. There's this idea of infinite realities. And we are just a constellation of unfolding potentials in mutual process with the world around us. Epistemology is about what the nature of knowledge is. So knowledge really is grounded in pattern. And so, pattern is interpreting the pattern that emerges out of the mutual process. So Richard Calling talks about, rather than focusing on parts, like the biopsychosocial spiritual, it's really looking at patterns that manifest as from experiences, perceptions, and expressions, because you can't reduce them into whole. So what is the person's experience, and what are they perceiving, and how are they expressing what they're perceiving? Those are manifestations of the whole, and those become the operational concepts within this, within the science. And that knowing isn't just from thinking, there's also pan-dimensional modes of awareness. So using mystical experience and there's other forms of knowing other than consciousness. So intuition, tacit knowing, mystical experience, all those are also ways of knowing, but all that information is interpreted within a unitary context. And this work comes out of this article I encourage you all to read Richard's work. He was my dissertation chair. It's been inspirational to me. But this movement, the difference between thinking from a unitary perspective to, of how that's different from thinking from a holistic or systems perspective. Martha wanted to move away. She didn't want to confuse holism with unitary thinking, because unitary is really going beyond holism, because holism is still looking at parts. So here's some examples in the middle of phenomena that can be interpreted from a unitary perspective beyond systems thinking. And then moving away from a systems model of thinking where you're kind of like focusing on these parts, to looking at a unitary way of thinking and interpreting, which I know that's a little blurry, but manifestations of experiences, expressions, and perceptions are what's in the middle there. And those are the patterns that are emerging out of the human environmental field process. And that's what the focus of nursing is on it from a unitary perspective. I developed a system of ethics. I'll just show the slide. This is in a 1999 article where I read all of Martha's works, and I looked at, what are the values that she believed in that are embedded within her work and within the way she lived her life. And I identified these, what I would call manifestations of ethical ways of being open, having reverence to art, to the universe, embracing connectedness, this idea of embracing optimism and change. These are sort of like value systems that are part of a unitary perspective from Roger's perspective, and that in practice involves living the ethics. So she lived these ethics in her work, but when you practice from a Rogerian perspective, you are also embracing these ideas of justice creative and using wisdom and compassion, being responsible. All those are part of the system of Rogerian ethics. And aesthetics, the last branch of philosophy, is appreciating the kaleidoscope. These are metaphors that actually Martha used in her own work. She talked about pattern as like looking through a kaleidoscope because it's constantly changing and it's unpredictable. And that because everything is in motion and everything is vibration, it's like a symphony. The universe is like a symphony of patterns that are flowing together. So the idea of kaleidoscope and symphony and music to me are really artistic ways of conceptualizing and thinking about what the meaning of pattern and what the meaning of Rogerian science is. And so from a unitary perspective, if you want to practice and incorporate aesthetics, it's really, creating meaning when appreciating the person's pattern, from looking at pattern as this manifestation of kaleidoscopic and symphonic manifestations of pattern, and looking and finding meaning in the person's experiences and participating knowingly in the person's process of change, and actually engaging in this, unitary pattern practice, to me, are all part of the aesthetic of Rogerian practice. And then this is a diagram that shows the flow between the philosophy, the science, the other theories. They flow into a research methodologies and into practice methodologies. And both of them are about creating knowing participation and change, changing patterns, and creating potentials for well-being. And I think I should stop there. And I go on. You can see these slides later on. These are a list of all the different theories that have evolved from Rogerian science and the references. So there's a lot of work that has been developed that have built on Roger's ideas, including Marlene Smith's theory listed here as the theory of unitary-caring. And then there's a practice methodology that's been spelled out in multiple publications. The nursing process is not what you use. So it's really these two nonlinear processes. And this method opens you up, this view opens nursing up to multiple modalities and practice modalities that go beyond perhaps what other models would embrace. So these are sort of like holistic modalities that are consistent with this worldview, but it doesn't replace and change the other things that we do as nurses that are like those 565 interventions in the NIC classification. Those are all things that nurses do, but those are reinterpreted as patterning modalities that are energetic as well. It's just that this system opens you up to other kinds of ways of practicing that are more grounded in a unitary perspective than in a participant way. So I'm going to stop here.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's absolutely wonderful. It's been such a, there are no coincidences, as you might have a look in the chat. There's some wonderful comments, but it's so perfect that we're coming to the closure of this morning's program, and you were the perfect kind of foundational presenter to kind of bring things together and share the consistencies and the different forms of inquiry and how they cross reference each other. We are hugely grateful and appreciative to all of our caring science scholars. These people are the way showers for all of us, and it's time for us to carry this knowledge and move it forward as we continue to contribute to the field of unitary caring science. Just a final word or two from our panelists, and then we will have to move on to lunch. Dr. Smith, we're so appreciative of you being here. Any final words, and then it will be Dr. Ray and Dr. Watson, please.
No, I mean, I was blown away by everybody's presentation, and I always learn so much, you know, even though I've heard Doctors Watson, Butcher, and Ray before, there's always something new in there that I learn and really touches me. So thank you all. It's wonderful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And Dr. Ray, we're so grateful that you're here today. Any final words from you?
I was just going to say, Howard, your work is so comprehensive. It's just so mind expanding. And, you know, I just feel like it resonates with Dr. Watson's with the idea of energy, you know, as caring, and then love is the universal. So I see it all totally integrated together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ray. We appreciate your time and your beautiful knowledge sharing. And Dr. Watson.
Well, Dr. Butcher, you just kind of provided this huge kaleidoscope of a canvas to hold it all. So it's so inspiring, and the whole cosmology. I think what I was really struck with, even though I've studied this as well, is the way you emphasize the epistemology piece and the knowing, and the whole context of course, the pan-dimensionality. But all of this is just so grounding and holding the bigger picture of all the emergence of the theories, and help us understand where they're located and why and how we need to evolve toward this broader cosmology of Rogerian. It holds it all in its hands, so to speak. So I'm so grateful for this inspiration and knowledge that you bring so comprehensively. Thank you.
Thank you.
Obrigada, muchas gracias. And as you talk about, it was Blake, is it Blake, the grain of sand? Blake?
Blake, yeah. See
That right? Grain of
see
sand.
the world in a grain of
So,
sand.
as we are all, you know, grains of sand people, but we are contributing to the whole, to this beautiful field of infinite love. And with that, take care of yourself. Go and have some nurturing food, take a rest, close your eyes. The translators, my goodness, we are so grateful for you. Let's give them a hand.
Realmente maravilloso, maravilloso.
Thank
you.
you so much. We
Thank
love you.
Gracias. Thank you, Julie.
We love you so much. Thank you so much for all you've done for us today and all.
Thank you.